What happens when a wildfire sweeps through one of the wealthiest cities in the world, and the world blames nature? But Donald Trump, the man everyone least expects, uncovers something far more sinister. The answer will leave you speechless. In early January 2025, Los Angeles found itself under siege as relentless wildfires ripped through the region, fueled by fierce Santa Ana winds. Entire neighborhoods turned into infernos, and the once iconic skyline was obscured by an eerie orange haze. Over 10,000 structures were reduced to ash, and at least 11 lives were claimed by the flames. More than 180,000 residents were forced to flee, leaving their homes behind. It was a crisis like no other, and it seemed as though nature itself had turned against the city. But as the fires raged on, the Trump family, who had been in the city for a series of engagements, found themselves caught in the midst of the chaos. President Donald Trump, now the former President of the United States, had come to California for a fundraiser. His wife, Melania, joined him on the trip, and their youngest son, Barron, was home in New York attending university. But Donald Trump had a different reaction to the crisis than the rest of the world. While others looked on helplessly, he could not ignore the strange alignment of events. As the flames grew, so did his suspicions. Something didn't add up. He sat in his hotel room, flipping through news reports on his phone. His mind raced as he began to notice a disturbing pattern. The fire's ignition points, as reported by the fire department, seemed to follow an almost intentional trajectory. Not random, not accidental. A path that raised more questions than answers. His suspicions grew, and he couldn't shake the feeling that these fires were no accident, a natural disaster or a carefully orchestrated catastrophe. Donald Trump wasn't one to sit idly by when something seemed off, and this fire was no exception. As the devastation spread, he couldn't stop thinking about the pattern he had seen. The fires, though destructive, seemed to have a strange precision to them. It was as if they were being directed with intent. This wasn't just a natural disaster, this was something else. As the former president continued to study the news, he started to piece together other anomalies. Areas that were hit the hardest, like the affluent neighborhoods of Pacific Palisades and Malibu, seemed like they had been targeted. Once luxurious homes were reduced to rubble, while neighboring areas remained mostly untouched. Something didn't sit right with him. With decades of experience navigating the complexities of business and politics, Donald Trump knew when something was wrong. This felt wrong. But what could it be? He had lived through political scandals, corporate rivalries, and the deepest conspiracies, but this was different. The fires weren't just a tragedy, they were an opportunity. An opportunity for who, though, and why? Was there something more to this catastrophe than met the eye? Intrigued, Trump reached out to his advisors, asking them to look into the situation. Meanwhile, his staff struggled to keep up with the rising concerns of both the public and officials in the state of California. Still, his curiosity couldn't be silenced. Donald Trump wasn't the kind of man who would let an unexplained mystery slip away. With the media in a frenzy, pointing fingers at natural causes, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He called on some of his trusted contacts, experts in fire safety, engineering, and security. He wasn't satisfied with the official reports. They lacked the details he needed. The pattern he saw couldn't be dismissed. As his investigation deepened, Donald Trump began to see what others had missed. This wasn't just nature doing its work. There was something far more calculated at play. Someone or something was behind the fires, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Donald Trump's instincts told him that what he was uncovering was bigger than anyone had anticipated. As he dug further, new details started to emerge. Details that sent a chill down his spine. Satellite imagery, fire department reports, and even interviews with those on the ground began to confirm his suspicions. The fires had a calculated, almost military precision. Certain ignition points located in rural areas seemed to follow a path that made no sense. It wasn't random. As he pored over the maps and reports, he saw a pattern of fire outbreaks aligning in ways that suggested something deliberate. Areas like the Ventura County foothills, once untouched by major wildfires, had been struck in rapid succession. With his curiosity now fully ignited, Donald Trump reached out to former colleagues and business contacts, asking them to gather more intelligence. He knew how these things worked. Sometimes you had to go off the record to get to the truth. Several names surfaced in his inquiries, including the controversial Solvista Holdings, a name that kept popping up in recent land deals. Trump's business experience told him that someone was using the chaos of the fires as a cover for something far more sinister. In the days that followed, Trump became more involved, quietly gathering evidence that others seemed to ignore. He reviewed land purchase records, seeking out companies that had been buying up properties in fire-prone areas for months. There was a pattern. Solvista Holdings had acquired land just weeks before the fires erupted. The land they purchased, mostly in high-risk zones, had suddenly turned into a prime target for redevelopment. But what was more disturbing was the fact that these purchases were not made at market rates. They were inflated, suspiciously high, and connected to corporate entities that appeared to have little to no experience in land development. Something about the whole operation screamed of ulterior motives. Donald Trump's investigation led him to a company with a shadowy reputation, Solvista Holdings. Its founder, Victor Grayson, was a name that no one seemed to know well. His company had been involved in several real estate developments, but his real business interests were far less transparent. The more Trump investigated, the clearer the picture became. Solvista Holdings seemed to have a hand in the land acquisitions, but they weren't the only players involved. The complexity of the situation deepened. There were whispers of corporate sabotage, with some claiming that the fires were no accident, that the very companies responsible for causing the devastation were also positioned to profit from it. Donald Trump couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something truly massive. But in his pursuit of the truth, he couldn't ignore the danger that now seemed to be closing in. Those responsible for this catastrophe would go to great lengths to protect their secrets. The deeper Trump went, the more dangerous his mission became. Donald Trump's gut told him he was dangerously close to unraveling something that could shake the very foundation of California's real estate industry. But as his investigation progressed, he began to feel the weight of the threat against him. The more he uncovered, the more people started to notice. His every move, every call, every step was being watched. His hotel room, where he'd been working late into the night, suddenly felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. He had been meticulous in documenting his findings, and now the room seemed to be closing in on him. Late one evening, as he sat at his desk, a strange feeling washed over him. It was an unsettling sense of being observed. Someone was out there waiting. His instincts were sharper than ever, but the danger was no longer abstract. It was real. It didn't take long for the warning signs to show up. A black SUV had parked outside the building earlier in the day, and now it was back, idling ominously across the street. Donald Trump knew that he had to be careful. He had seen this kind of intimidation before in his business dealings, but this time, the stakes were much higher. What he was uncovering wasn't just a corporate scandal, it was something much darker, far more dangerous. He couldn't afford to ignore the mounting tension. With his findings in hand, he reached out to a trusted journalist, someone who had a reputation for exposing corruption in the corporate world. Linda Moreno was known for breaking stories that had toppled powerful individuals and organizations, and now Trump needed her expertise. When they met, Linda listened intently as Trump outlined everything he had discovered: Solvista Holdings, the inflated land prices, the deliberate alignment of the fires, and the evidence that suggested corporate manipulation of the entire crisis. She knew that if these claims were true, it would be a bombshell, but she also understood the risks involved. "Donald," Linda said after a long pause, "this could blow the lid off everything, but we're not the only ones watching. Whoever's behind this has deep pockets and a lot of power. We're not just dealing with an industry scandal. We're dealing with something that could have far-reaching consequences." Linda didn't mince words. She was a seasoned investigative journalist, but even she felt the weight of what they were about to uncover. The corporate and political connections that were at play went deep, much deeper than either of them anticipated. "We need to tread carefully," Linda warned. "There's no turning back once we release this information." Despite the risks, Donald Trump was resolute. He had come too far to turn back now. The people needed to know the truth. The fires that had devastated Los Angeles weren't just a natural disaster, they were a man-made tragedy, and he had the evidence to prove it. But even as he and Linda began working to compile the full report, they couldn't ignore the increasing pressure. It wasn't just the surveillance or the cryptic messages they were receiving. It was the constant feeling of being one step behind their adversaries. Someone was making sure their every move was being monitored. And Trump knew all too well that they weren't just fighting against an invisible enemy. They were up against powerful, ruthless people who wouldn't hesitate to stop them from exposing the truth. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Donald Trump and Linda worked tirelessly, sifting through the evidence, cross-referencing documents, and preparing to release the story to the world. But the deeper they dug, the more danger they found themselves in. The black SUV had become a constant presence, always lurking in the background, as if the shadow of their adversaries had lengthened with each new discovery. One afternoon, as Donald was reviewing the latest batch of emails he had obtained, a sudden knock on his hotel room door jolted him upright. His heart raced as he walked cautiously to the door, his mind already racing with possibilities. Who could it be? Had their investigation been compromised? He opened the door, half expecting an empty hallway, but instead, he was met with the cold glare of a man in a suit. The stranger's face was familiar. He had seen him a few times, always at a distance, but now he was standing right in front of him. Without saying a word, the man handed him a thick envelope before turning and walking away, leaving Trump with more questions than answers. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper typed in bold letters, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." A chill ran down Donald's spine as he read the warning. He had expected threats, but this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. He knew that they were closing in on something big, something that the people behind the fires would stop at nothing to keep hidden. But it only fueled his resolve. He couldn't back down now. Not when so many innocent lives had been affected by the fires. Not when he had uncovered enough evidence to expose a conspiracy of unimaginable proportions. That evening, as he sat in the dim light of his hotel room, he received a call that would change everything. Linda's voice was frantic on the other end of the line. "Donald, you need to get out of there. They're onto us. My sources are telling me they've already started scrambling, shutting things down. If you don't move quickly, you're going to be next." His pulse quickened. He knew this was coming, the walls were closing in. But Donald Trump had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not when the stakes were so high. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We're too close. We can't stop now." Linda urged him to be cautious, but Trump could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his next move. There were lives at stake, and he wasn't going to be intimidated into silence. The next day, as he made his way through the streets of Los Angeles, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. The black SUV, which had tailed him for days, was nowhere to be seen, but he knew that didn't mean he was safe. Whoever was behind this wouldn't just disappear. They were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And strike they did. As Donald was leaving a meeting with a trusted ally who had agreed to help him with the investigation, a car sped by, its tires screeching in a loud, deliberate warning. It was as if they were sending a message, a reminder that he was treading dangerous ground. But Donald Trump was undeterred. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He knew that exposing the truth would come with consequences, but he was ready to face them. The days grew darker as the investigation reached its final stages. Trump's phone rang constantly, each call a reminder of how close he was to the edge. And then came the bombshell. The corporate records he had secured were enough to expose the massive financial interests behind the fires. He knew that the story they were preparing to release would change everything, but as the hours ticked away, he felt a growing sense of unease. Someone was closing in on him. The calls, the threats, the surveillance, they were all part of a larger strategy to intimidate him into silence. But Donald Trump had never been one to shy away from a fight. It was time to reveal the truth. The morning dawned gray and ominous, the weight of the city's secrets pressing down on Donald Trump as he sat in the small, dimly lit room at his hotel. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to send the final piece of evidence to the press, a document that would expose the powerful corporate interests behind the wildfires. He knew that once the story was out, there would be no going back. The backlash would be swift, and the risks would be even greater. But he had come too far to turn back now. As he hit the send button, his phone rang again. It was Linda. Her voice, typically calm and composed, now carried an edge of panic. "Donald, you need to listen to me carefully. They've already started making moves. There's a hit on your life right now as we speak. You're not safe. I don't know how much longer you can keep going." Trump's heart raced, but his voice remained steady. "I've already made my decision. The truth is out now and nothing can change that." Linda's silence on the other end spoke volumes. She understood the gravity of the situation. This was no longer just about exposing a conspiracy. It was about survival. He knew the risks, but they had already paid the price for this investigation. So many had suffered, and the truth could no longer be buried. The corporate giants who had orchestrated the destruction of so many lives would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. But Donald Trump was determined to shine a light on the darkness. Hours later, as he stepped outside to make his way to a safe house, the weight of his decision hit him harder than ever. The city had never felt more dangerous. Every step he took felt like it was being watched, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. But there was no turning back now. Suddenly, a black SUV appeared in his peripheral vision, its headlights blinding in the foggy morning light. His pulse quickened as he instinctively reached for his phone, but before he could react, the vehicle screeched to a halt in front of him. The doors opened swiftly, and a man stepped out, his face concealed by a dark mask. "Get in the car," the man ordered, his voice cold and menacing. Trump hesitated for only a moment. He knew he couldn't trust this figure, but he also knew that his life was hanging by a thread. His mind raced. This could be the end of his story, or it could be the beginning of something even bigger. He glanced toward the alleyway behind him, weighing his options. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the city itself was holding its breath. A decision had to be made. Just as the man reached for him, another car pulled up, and this time it was a familiar face. It was Linda, her car screeching to a halt as she threw the door open and called out to him, "Donald, get in quick, they found us, we don't have much time." Without thinking, he bolted toward her car, narrowly avoiding the masked man's grasp. The engine roared to life as Linda slammed the pedal to the floor, speeding off into the chaos of the city streets. The black SUV gave chase, but Linda's driving skills were sharp, and she knew the city well. She darted through narrow alleys, zigzagging through traffic, and finally managed to shake off their pursuers. As they drove in silence, Trump's mind was racing. He knew that time was running out, and every moment they spent in hiding only increased the danger. He had already taken a huge risk by exposing the conspiracy, but now the stakes were even higher. Linda broke the silence. "Donald, we have to get you out of this city. They'll be watching every move you make." He nodded grimly. "We're not finished yet. Not until they answer for what they've done." The night was long, filled with moments of tension, but as dawn began to break, a sense of resolution settled over him. He had done what he set out to do. The truth was out there, and it would reverberate across the nation. The battle was far from over, but Donald Trump had learned that some fights were worth risking everything for. Because in the end, it wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy. It was about ensuring that those who suffered from it could finally find justice. As the story spread across media outlets, the world began to take notice. The corporate elites behind the wildfires were scrambling to cover their tracks, but the truth had already taken root. No amount of power or influence could undo the damage that had been done, nor could they silence those who were determined to stand up for what was right. And for Donald Trump, the weight of it all was both a burden and a badge of honor. He had faced the fire and come out the other side, and in the process, he had reminded the world of the power of one man's determination to make a difference. Days passed, and the fallout from Donald Trump's revelation spread like wildfire, pun intended. The media erupted with coverage. The world suddenly obsessed with the conspiracy he had uncovered. Headlines shouted the names of the corporate giants responsible for the devastation, exposing their ties to corrupt officials, shady dealings, and a far-reaching network that spanned the globe. The public outcry was deafening, but with the truth came a new challenge: safety. Trump had become a target, and those who had aided him were now at risk too. The network of power players whose interests had been exposed would not forgive easily. Even as Trump's phone rang incessantly with calls of support from the public and political allies, the looming threat of retaliation was ever present. The safe house where Trump was hiding felt like a prison. His every movement was monitored, and the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. Linda, ever vigilant, kept her distance but maintained communication through encrypted channels. She knew the risks all too well. The firestorm was far from over. One evening, as Trump sat in the dimly lit room with only the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional tapping of his fingers on the table to keep him company, he received a call. It wasn't from Linda, nor was it from any of his usual contacts. This one was different. "Mr. Trump," the voice on the other end said, calm and measured. "You don't know me, but I've been following your work. You've exposed the truth. Now it's time to take the next step. You're not alone in this fight." Trump leaned forward, his mind racing. "Who is this?" "I can't give you my name, but I know what you've uncovered. The people you've exposed are powerful, and they won't stop. But there are others who've been watching, and we have resources. If you want to keep fighting, we can help." For the first time in days, Trump felt a glimmer of hope. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," the voice replied bluntly. "But you don't have much of a choice. Either you accept our help or you continue fighting alone, knowing the odds are stacked against you." Trump's thoughts flashed to the countless lives ruined by the firestorm that had engulfed California, to the families displaced, to the injustice that had fueled it all. He had no choice. He could not walk away now. "I'll take the help," he said, determination in his voice. "But know this, if I'm going to do this, I will do it my way." The voice on the other end chuckled, a slight edge of amusement. "We wouldn't have it any other way." As the call ended, Trump sat back, his mind racing with the enormity of the decision he had just made. The path ahead was more uncertain than ever, but it was also clearer. He was no longer fighting alone. And with this new alliance, there was a chance, just a glimmer of a chance, to finally hold those responsible accountable. The weeks that followed were a blur of high-stakes meetings, clandestine operations, and an increasing sense of urgency. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had ever imagined, but now he had the resources to combat it head-on. The enemies he had exposed had begun to fight back, but Trump was relentless. Every piece of evidence, every ally, and every truth he unearthed brought him closer to his ultimate goal: justice. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the weight of the burden seemed too much to bear. There were moments when it seemed like the battle was slipping out of his grasp. But Donald Trump was never one to back down from a challenge, and with every obstacle, his resolve only grew stronger. In the end, the corporate elites were brought to justice. The conspiracy was dismantled, and the wildfires, which had been fueled by greed and corruption, were exposed for the world to see. Families who had lost everything in the fires began to rebuild, their voices heard and their pain acknowledged. Donald Trump had done what many believed was impossible. He had faced down powerful enemies, risked his life, and uncovered the truth. And through it all, he had remained steadfast in his pursuit of justice. As he stood at a press conference, surrounded by reporters, he realized that this journey, this fight for truth, wasn't just about him. It was about the people who had suffered in silence, the families whose lives had been torn apart by forces they couldn't understand. It was about reminding the world that no matter how powerful the darkness, the light of truth would always find a way through. And as the camera flashes illuminated the room, Donald Trump finally allowed himself a moment of peace. He had done more than expose a conspiracy. He had given hope to those who had none, and in doing so, had shown the world that even in the face of the greatest challenges, one person could make a difference. The truth had won.